Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today, we are unfortunately down Eli, but we're going to be digging into the film today is Marvel's Eternals, the 2021 superhero film in the MCU, directed by Chloe Zhao. And joined with us today is a special guest, return expert in the archaeological and the pseudo-archaeological, David S. Anderson. David, thank you. Really glad we could get you on the show, and thanks for coming back.
Yeah,
thank you guys for having me back. This is I think we talked about doing this film the first time, but it is, Crystal Skull was an easier start.
We were talking, and then this was one that sort of naturally came up, I think, and we were originally discussing films, and this one's been on sort of our radar for a while. But yeah, we'll start with David. Do you dig this movie?
Oh gosh, no. I think there's everything about this movie is it's weird and problematic on so many ways. And I think it's like they tried to make a very modern superhero movie, but they insisted on using, although they transformed a lot, some pretty old source material. And that source material, unfortunately, is directly emulating Eric von Daniken's 1968 Chariots of the Gods, which, for those who are not directly familiar, it's not the origins of the ancient alien idea. We can actually plumb those depths a little bit tonight, I'm sure, but it's the popularization moment of the ancient alien claim, which inherently suggests over and over again that indigenous people could not have built pyramids and buildings and other things without some sort of extraterrestrial help. And I think like my biggest consternation with this film is that there was such a direct attempt to present a diverse cast and an untraditional director for Hollywood, especially for a superhero film.
Yeah.
And in other words, there's a lot of awareness on the surface that is masking some very deep racial problems that are laid out sort of in this storyline.
Were you familiar with the Jack Kirby comics before the movie, or was this movie kind of the gateway to that for you?
Oh no, this has been on my radar for a while, and I'd read the original Kirby comics, which came out I was just double checking. The first one was in 1976, and it was a relatively short storyline with Jack Kirby, Kirby, it's really interesting because Kirby was one of the big writers and artists for Marvel when Marvel first had its heyday in the Silver Age in the early 1960s. And he had some falling outs with Stan Lee, who was the other big force at Marvel at the time. And this was how Kirby came back to Marvel. And it was like it was promised to let him write this book. And the really interesting thing, there's sort of a bookended issue here. Kirby was writing Ancient Alien stuff in the early 60s before Eric von Daniken's 68 book came out. And then the Eternals comes out in 76. And so it's Kirby's revisiting. In fact, there's there's a lot of echoes between some of the stuff. It's some early Fantastic Four materials in it's like Fantastic Four number 64, which I think comes out in the 7 or something like this. It comes out before Von Daniken's book, has sort of the same beginning as Eternals number 1 does. And so it's like, but there's things in the Eternals book that deliberately references some of Eric Von Daniken's materials. I think one of my favorite sort of problematic moments is in Eternals number 1. There's the letter to the readers from Kirby himself, where he winks and nods, where he's like, "This might be true. You don't know. It could really be true." And so when Marvel said they were going to make this movie, I was just like, "Guys, why? Like, why? Like, you don't have to do this. You can leave your old problematic stories on the shelf and not return them to the limelight." And they did anyway.
Yeah. So I watched this movie the first time on a flight to or from Italy, pretty deep into the flight too. So like weird state of mind to be watching it for sure. And the Eternals as characters, as influence for different mythological figures, I'm sure we're going to unpack all of that. But I'm just like, this makes the least amount of sense in a lot of ways to me compared to other things that exist in the Marvel universe. And probably the closest was Thor and the Norse gods and Asgard, which was already kind of ancient aliens going on. And so like this whole aspect of like, oh, Athena, not Athena, but inspiration for Athena, and robot has mind weird things happening. And I'm just like, what is happening here? And I think that's why it fell flat in a lot of ways, just as like a general superhero movie of it feels really out of place. And I agree with you, David, that like this one probably could be left on the shelf and it would have been perfectly fine.
It is an interesting thought exercise, just sort of on the stuff of like why, like of all of the things to go back in the archives and in the inventory that Marvel has, you know, why did they pick Eternals and in this stage? And I wonder, because if it was something like where like Guardians of the Galaxy was a bit of like before the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, they were kind of C-listy, you know, B-list, C-list tier, and maybe the idea was like, you know, we kind of struck gold with that, maybe we could do it, you know, maybe we could repeat it, where, you know, the logic being, David mentioned, you know, we'll pluck an up and coming indie director. Chloe Zhao had not, I think when she was hired, she hadn't won the Oscar yet, but was quickly going to. So, you know, the kind of that formula, and it's almost like you can see the sort of studio algorithm being like, you know, pick C-list sort of group of superheroes, pluck indie director who's on the rise, give them couple $1 million or $1 billion. I'm not sure how much I can look up how much this movie costs, but it's probably like $1 billion, and hire a bunch of stars and then like, you know, print money. And then even we were talking a little bit about this when last week we were talking, or last episode we were talking with Jason Nethercutt about the Thor movies. And where was I going with this? Oh, and the sort of, it doesn't always, like, even among Marvel movies, like Marvel movies sort of generally, one of the things, you know, whether you like the MCU or not, but like they generally have a good sort of quality control level. Like even the worst ones are still pretty functional as movies, although I would say this one is.
Oh, but can we go Love and Thunder for a second?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, so this is I have a couple of thoughts about my sort of thesis. Like there's things that I like, and I think there's some interesting ideas sort of buried in this movie, but the most interesting things, first of all, there's just like a lot of things happening in this movie. But the most interesting things they kind of don't focus on, and they focus on the less interesting things. And one of the big things is kind of the initial premise that, like, yeah, David was talking about, is that the gods and, you know, all of these different mythological systems and gods and really even human sort of progress has been guided by these aliens, essentially, whether they're robots or something like that.
There's some interesting transformations that I think we should talk about, of between sort of who the Eternals were originally and who they became in this film. But to address briefly the why did they make this choice, one of the things that sort of surprised me, because they announced this movie pretty early on with the end of Phase 3 as Phase 4 was starting, and I assumed because the obvious connection between Phase 3 and Phase 4, from my perspective when they announced the Eternals, was that Thanos, the big bad from Phase 3 and Phase 1 and Phase 2, I guess, he's an Eternal. That is actually his lineage and origin in the comic books. And so I assumed that was going to be the rationale, like, oh, we've got to do the Eternals now because we have to explain who Thanos was. But then they left that. They very exceedingly vaguely alluded to it with the post-credit scene,
where Harry
when they
Styles
bring
shows
in
up.
Harry Styles shows up as Eros, who is, like, as I understand it, Thanos' brother. But it's like that was the justification, as far as I could tell, of like, why should we make this movie? But then they just completely let it go.
And I mean, my other sort of thought is like to that, yeah, like where if you look at, you sort of take a step back and you look at kind of like the breadth of Marvel, like in Phase 4, it seems to be broadening out the world, whether that's through different universes, like what's going on with Doctor Strange, or space sort of more broadly, you know, like now we can go broader and broader and broader and sort of get to, you know, all these sort of different stories. And the Eternals is one way to do that. But this movie kind of maybe inadvertently like introduces all these little weird wrinkles in, like, if you just even think internally to the MCU universe and what we know about it. Like, I mean, just little stuff, like there's 2 jokes about DC superheroes. There's like a Batman joke and a super, which is like kind of like the implications of if those comic books are real in this universe and like what's going on there. But even stuff with like the way, like the universe kind of like the cosmology, because one of the things we kind of got a little bit, I more so than others got a little bit hung up about when we were talking about Thor, was like the interesting idea of like, what are the gods doing for us and should we get rid of the gods, is a good one, but it becomes tricky because in this universe, it's very unclear what is and is not a god, because we've got sort of Asgardians who are maybe aliens, maybe gods. We've got the Celestials who are kind of god-like. And then the Eternals really like throw the biggest wrinkle in, because they are the inspiration for a lot of the mythological systems are simultaneously real. Like Asgard's a place and Olympus is a place you could go to, see Zeus or Odin or whoever. But then also there are these other figures who are like a sort of slant version of mythological gods and goddesses, like Athena.
Who is a god and what is a god in the MCU now is becoming a really super muddied waters. And Thor Love and Thunder really muddied those waters more with their trip to, I forget what they called it, but they went to the home of the real
city.
gods. The Omnipotent City, there we go. Yeah, it's like where they're the real gods, and you can only get in there if you were a real god. And that's one of they took the Eternals down a notch for this film, because the sort of the original origin story is the Celestials came to Earth and the Celestials created the Eternals, the Deviants, and humans. And they were all, and in essence, the Eternals were, I mean, this is where like Kirby really was cribbing Von Däniken. Like the Eternals were the gods that humans just sort of misidentified.
Yes.
And the Deviants were the devils and the demons that people misidentified. So they totally transformed the Deviants for this movie, making them this sort of external peril that Earth was facing, rather than sort of gods and devils of Earth. It was, and yeah, so it's. I was having a conversation with some other folks about this recently. It's like the MCU has gone heavy cosmology, and the Eternals was a big part of like what is the cosmological makeup of the MCU, and they have really like muddied the waters here of like what is a deity and what is divine and what is a fake god or what is an almost god, and that like we got Hercules coming now apparently, who's going to be like a semi-divine god. Like we got a lot of muddied waters,
and it also it creates this weird relationship with like myth and myth tradition, where like I keep thinking, so like they say that like basically one of the Eternals, Sprite, who's kind of like the illusionist and the show maker, and like her role, it was kind of like inspire humans with storytelling, and it says that she basically invented the Icarus myth to poke fun at her friend Icarus. And then at the end of the film, Icarus flies into the sun in a sort of like fulfillment of the myth, but it's like this weird, like, the myth is about him, but he's like reenacting the myth. That's also, and so he creates this, it's like an Ouroboros where like the circle just eats itself.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought of like where this category of gods was more the idea, and I think like this is where the diffusionist kind of aspect was coming in for me. It was like all stories, we talk about like the hero's journey and everything like that, like have kind of these central themes, and this is really kind of piling on the idea that Sprite or the Eternals themselves are the true inspiration for all versions of mythological stories that we have. And that's why you have these names that are represented in a bunch of different mythologies and religions, but they're actually part of one collective. So that was definitely the element of diffusion that is part of Atlantis, is part of Ancient Aliens, that was really coming through and was problematic.
And like what David was saying earlier, like kind of one of the root kernel of the problem with both the source material and I'm gonna go on a Jack Kirby rant later, but like the root kernel with like the problem is that like the movie sort of supplies the idea that like all human development and progress, whether that's technology through like Festus, who is basically inventing stuff for us, or he's showing us technology, or storytelling like Sprite or whatever, like we owe our whole civilization, the plural, to these Eternals who have been guiding us. And then the reveal, spoilers, is that we're being grown like a petri dish to feed a space god, the birth of a space god. And the Eternals, who are created to sort of facilitate this process, have like a sort of moment of reckoning. They defy their creators, basically. But that's the sort of like what Dave was saying, that the problem is it really undercuts particularly a lot of indigenous cultures, but culture sort of broadly, to say that like human beings haven't really, like we needed some sort of outside help to do anything.
Yeah, there's an inherent assumption in all ancient alien claims that humans are dumb, that they couldn't have invented, any, metallurgy or steam engines, as Hephaestus gives us,
or like a plow, right? Or like I wrote in my notes, I'm like, in 575 BC, I feel like we figured out the plow by then, right? Like the Babylonians have plows down.
Yeah.
But what do I know?
Well, and I'm also questioning too, like the names that I'm seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these are all from what we term as the old world. Like these are all old world mythological names, and we don't have any
Yeah, it's because
from
it's
North
yeah,
South America.
it's mostly Greek and Roman with like
Yeah.
Ajax, Mercury, Circe, and then a couple of, Gilgamesh. I think in the original comics, Kingo is like a samurai or something like that, or like he's a little
Yeah.
different, I think.
That sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, it's very Greco-Roman oriented, and I think that speaks a lot to unquestioned prejudices of the original authors and whatnot, and the
Hmm.
audience they were writing for, and what they would have expected and wanted.
Yeah. And it's funny too how also like some of them are like a letter off. Like you've got, Thena and Makari, just a slight, like a slightly different spelling pronunciation. Then you get Gilgamesh, which is just remains unchanged. But so I don't
That's
know.
okay.
And I
Yeah.
don't know what Kingo exactly is supposed to be. Yeah, it's just this idea of like on our civilization. There's another idea actually that I kind of wanted to get into, unless we had more to say about the aliens, which is another sort of like the central thesis of this movie that they keep saying is that there's something inherently special about humans and humanity that
hmm
inspires this internals to care, like, whether it's usually, and I feel like I've seen variations on this kind of motif before in other movies of like, even though humans are horrible and do genocide and slavery and war and all the horrible stuff, we're still worth saving because of love or art or hope or whatever it is. And I wanted to kind of unpack it because for me this was kind of like the weakest thesis of the movie, because just even in the MCU alone, like, they credit the humans with stopping Thanos, but like there were a lot of people that were not from Earth that helped stop Thanos. But
Yeah, that's true.
and
Much more
it doesn't,
expensive.
from what we've seen of other planets and cultures, humans don't seem to be, they don't seem to have any more or less like humanity than humans, as far as I can tell, at least.
Yeah, especially certainly in the MCU. I mean, all of the other species that we get to know are, yeah, that's actually an interesting point, because it's one of my favorite things about old sci-fi actually, is that humans are always the, like, if we go Star Trek, it's like humans are the jack of all trades and can do a little bit of everything, but
Hmm.
the Vulcans are super smart and logical. The Klingons are angry and strong, and it's like we used to imagine other alien species have some like specialized niche of humanity, but then humanity had this broad base of ability to do all kinds of things. But yeah, MCU like extraterrestrials are just as human as anybody else. Yeah.
I mean, that was what was hard about Thor sometimes too, in this question of like what makes a god and trying to come up with a definition of it. Because the very first god that Gore, I'm blanking on names now.
Gore
Is
the
that
God
Yeah,
Butcher.
Gore.
yeah?
Yeah, Gore and his
That he
rock
kills
god.
is a
Yeah.
god that none of us as humans would recognize. So it's like, all right, by definition, what is he using as a definition of a god? And I liked that because it complicated the idea of like not making humans central to all ideas of God, even though God is something that can exist in all these different alien cultures and groups. But at the same time, this movie does come back to the idea it's like, oh, but we're special enough to convert these specifically programmed robots to be empathetic towards us and save us from their programmed purpose,
Hmm.
which is also sci-fi in nature in terms of like, well, robots are not supposed to attack humanity. So
Hmm.
Although I do love, as we were talking about, this is an awkward fit into the MCU for so many reasons. I love the sort of like pre and the post, where lots of people were commenting when the movie came out, like, so the Eternals just sat by through the whole like Infinity War stuff, like the whole Thanos and everything, like
Hmm.
and they didn't lift their fingers then, but when the deviants show up, that's what's really bad. And then the post, I love how it's become a joke. Like, and She-Hulk made a quick joke about it, where there's this giant celestial reaching up out of the ocean, and no
mhm.
one ever brings it up. Like
Yeah,
it never.
we were joking about that with Jason last week, about like just in the sense of like if something that huge like emerged out of the ocean, like just the water displacement alone would be like catastrophic.
Yeah, yeah.
In terms, like, the sea levels would rise, many feet, which would be a problem for everyone. But yeah, like it is getting sort of messy, and they make a joke. They not a joke, but like Kit Harington, Dane, that's the character's name. He makes a comment. He's like, "Why did you sort of sit back through all of the horrible things that have happened in
Mm-hmm.
throughout history, which is like a classic sort of if the gods are question, right? It's a classic
Yeah.
question. Like if the gods are real, why do they not come and, fix things for us? And then usually the answer falls somewhere along the lines of like, we humans have to figure it out for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
The creators or the overseers or whoever can't intervene in the experiment
Mm-hmm.
that is us. But then there introduces like actually kind of a really interesting idea that I think just gets kind of storied away, where Festus says something to the effect of like, we were put here to give them the tools to sort of grow. Like we were just sort of designed to grow them. And the thing that
Yeah.
grows them faster than anything else is actually conflict and war, because it's actually like war leads to breakthroughs in technology and medicine that leads to population growth.
Mm-hmm.
And like just like there's sort of an interesting idea that like the big catalyst in human history for progress, I'm using air quotes, is actually conflict.
Mhm.
You know, I'd have to probe the script and look at the exact language here, but I remember certainly I took away a sort of like faux prime directive going on here, where like they almost seemed like they were forbidden to interfere with human events except for to protect them from the deviants. I think it seemed to me how they set it up. Is
I
that
think,
is that
yeah,
right?
that's
No?
Yeah.
that's basically the marching order. But then, and this is what drives the wedge between them, where eventually they're in Tenochtitlan, and the Spanish are massacring everyone, and this is where a druid has like a breakdown and basically like splits, and he says like, F the prime directive.
Yeah, yeah. That was oh yes, that was the first time of Mesoamerica showing up in the MCU, and we are on the cusp as of like the next tomorrow, I believe. Wakanda Forever
We're gonna
debuts,
see
and so
Namor, yeah.
Mhm.
we're going to see Namor. Yeah, this is yeah. I've got all kinds of feelings about this, but I haven't even seen that film. Obviously, I guess maybe some people have seen it now, but I don't know what they're going to do, and I'm very
Mhm.
worried.
Yeah. That's going to be interesting. We'll definitely have to come back and visit that because let's just throw Atlantis is kind of in there just for the fun of it. Or at least
Yeah,
I don't
well,
know if
and
it's
it's not going
truly
to be
Atlantis.
Atlantis
That's
anymore,
right.
which is like they're seriously retconning Namor and changing, one of Marvel's oldest characters to be something pretty different, to
Yeah.
be a Mesoamerican character, and it's now instead of Atlantis, the underwater kingdom is being called Talocan, which is a riff off of Tlalocan, which is an Aztec watery afterlife.
Mm.
And so I just read an article. I guess it was about the debut. So I don't know if this is. I haven't seen the film, but I just read an article earlier today, in essence suggesting that Namor had led his people into Talocan at the time of conquest to sort of keep them away from or save them from the invaders. Apparently that's what's going on, but I was this is my own like level of freak out because when the first trailer came out, it's like what the are they
Mm.
doing?
Mhm.
Because there are lots of old 19th century racist inspired claims that the Maya and the Aztec could not have built pyramids, etc. And so, that one of the old school explanations was that maybe they're Atlanteans, and it's like,
Mhm.
wait, you're making the Atlanteans Maya because that's
Mhm.
kind of problematic.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But then they rechristened it to Talocan instead of Atlantis, and so there's going to be a whole web of I don't know what they're doing here, and we'll see how it comes out.
This purely speculative because, like we said, the movie debuts tomorrow. But my sort of just pat read from the trailers is that maybe it's something. It's something like an American foil to Wakanda, where it's like,
Yeah,
whereas Wakanda is like was a secret hidden African kingdom that was way more advanced than everything around it. And then maybe Tlalocan is something to that effect. But
yeah. I've had some interesting conversations about this. I know we're kind of drifting here away from the core of Eternals, but there
it's
is this.
whatever.
As far as I understand, it seems like Wakanda has been very well received by as a sort of faux African nation that brings in inspiration from lots of different real African cultures, but
Mhm.
blends them into its own new thing. And that seems to have gone over well with most audiences, as far as I understand. And that's as you said, Colin. That seems to be what they're doing with Talocan now, which is very interesting to me because there are obvious Aztec influences and obvious
Mhm.
Maya influences in the way it's being set up so far. And to me, that sets off alarm bells because to this very day, right now, as I did this like a couple of days ago with my students, you can Google search Maya calendar, and one of the first things that comes up is the Aztec sunstone. And it's
Mhm.
like different cultures, different languages, different time periods. Like these are not the same. And there's a tremendous tendency. One of my old school favorites of this was the Hunt for El Dorado. Is that what it was called? There was an early aughts cartoon, The Quest for El Dorado, or
The
something like
Road to
this.
El Dorado.
Road to El
Yes.
Dorado. There we go.
Yes.
And it was did the same thing where it's like it's all these background elements that are not even Maya. Sometimes they're just generically Latin American background elements. And it's like my question always was, would in the Hunchback of Notre Dame cartoon, would they have accepted if the Colosseum was in the background of Paris? Like
Mm-hmm.
that wouldn't have happened, and yet you do this with Latin American or Mesoamerican cultures. And so there's this funny line where it's like, where Wakanda seems to be good and well represented and people like it, like where's the difference between sort of drawing on elements and building something new versus misrepresenting diversity and blurring lines and bringing things together and not knowing what's what.
Yeah, I could see that. Like, why Wakanda is probably so successful and makes sense is because there is Afrofuturism. Like, that
Yes.
is an actual
Mm-hmm.
cultural movement that Wakanda specifically speaks to. Versus, I don't think there's something equivalent to that for Mesoamerican cultures.
The best thing I've read recently is Rebecca Roanhorse's novel Black Sun, which is not indigenous futurism, but more indigenous fantasy,
Mhm.
where you're taking an indigenous author from the Americas, taking American cultures and writing fantasy literature based on it. But so it's similar, but not the same.
I think have either of you read or heard of, is it Gods of Jade and Shadow? Sylvia Moreno Garcia. It's sort of like,
Yes, I've seen it, but not read it.
I read it sort of recently, but the premise is kind of, I think, what you're describing. It's fantasy, and the premise is it's in Mexico in the 20s, and it starts in the Yucatan, and she finds and she basically gets in contact with like a Mayan god of death, and then and they have to travel, and part of it is like the exploring sort of the mythology, but it's also like a view of like Mexico in the 20s at a time of like rapid modernization and all sorts of other sort of in like cultures and influences coming in. Like it's an interesting read, but I think it is kind of speaking to a little bit of that kind of, or just there's a broader influence generally I'm seeing in a lot of like fantasy and YA of non-Eurocentric
Mm-hmm.
settings and inspired settings, things like that.
Oh, I was just gonna say it might have made more sense for Namor to
Yeah.
like that
Originally Namor, but because it's Mesoamerica now, it's going to be Namor.
Namor. Okay. So it might have made more sense to go more of the magical realism route in that
Mhm.
regard. And like that's just it. He's the first mutant. So like
Yes.
Mhm.
however that or like one of the original mutants. So like however that's going to like that's just it. It's like the source material to start with is problematic and you can retcon it as much as you want, but for it to be recognizable as part of the Marvel universe, it's gonna have to fit the source material in some way. So
Yeah,
they
I'm
they
just
were successful with Wakanda. I don't know that they'll be as successful with this one.
it is so curious to me because Phase 4 has broadened out in so many ways and brought in and I feel like we're only like a year out, but I could be wrong. I think the Eternals has largely dropped off people's radars. Like it
Mhm.
doesn't seem to be one of the movies that has grabbed people's attention, and which hits to the same moments of Wakanda Forever. Like, is it going to repeat are we going to have a bunch of like 3 spin-off Namor movies now, or is this going to slide off and not be paid attention to? I don't know.
Yeah.
And is Harry Styles coming back? I don't know.
It wouldn't be the first time that a post-credit scene has promised us something and never delivered. Like there's a
Mm.
lot
I
of
was
early phase.
wondering about that. I haven't tried to like look them all up and again. I feel like most of them have delivered the post-credit scenes. Is there one that stands out?
There is one, and that's in Guardians 2. There's a post-credit scene with the gold people, and she has like this pod, and she talks
Hmm.
about she's going to create some kind of like perfect being, and that's an allusion to Adam Warlock. And a lot of people were
Hmm.
speculating that he was going to show up for the Thanos stuff, because in the comics, Adam Warlock's kind of a big player in the Infinity War
Okay.
series. But that so far we have yet to see anything Adam Warlock. Although now it all seems so plotted out that
Hmm.
it seems, and they have just all the money in the world to play with, that like
Hmm.
I can't see why we won't necessarily see Harry Styles coming back. But
Yeah.
but then again, like you said, there doesn't seem, no one's champing at the bit for Eternals 2,
Yeah.
at least as
Yeah.
far as I can tell. This movie was a bit of a dud commercially and financially, so we'll see. Although Let me see. Let me actually look up the numbers
I haven't
because
looked up the numbers. I that is certainly the sense in the feel that I have. I've got I've got a bunch of like college students who are also Marvel fans, and they were just kind of like, "What was that
yeah,
movie? I don't
like
get it."
I think this might just be a testament to the juggernaut that is Marvel because it had a budget of 200 million and box office of 402 million, which I think for most movies would be considered good, but for a
Yeah,
Marvel movie is considered
yeah,
middling to poor. Like
Yeah.
people were saying that like, oh no, is like Captain Marvel like ruined? It was a complete failure, and people only said that because it didn't make as much money as Black Panther, which made so much money.
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
Well,
and it also came out during the pandemic. So, like, a lot of
Yeah,
releases, yeah, it had theatrical release, but
this is true. Yeah, we can't. The box office returns during 2000 in 2021 are not exactly indicative of there's a weird other factor to it.
mhm.
absolutely. No, this also reminds me. It's Jason Colavito, who's a skeptic and author who writes a lot about ancient alien stuff too. Has pointed out several times that the Ancient Alien TV show is down to about 1 million viewers an episode, and he focuses on TV a lot more in the industry of TV more than I do, and so I take him at his word on this that that's bad. That's a really low number. But every time he says like that's a low number, they have 1 million people. I'm like, I think
Yeah,
like 10
Yeah.
people came to my last lecture. Like I don't know
yeah,
that a
Yeah.
million sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
yeah. It's a lot
Well,
bigger. It's a lot bigger platform than this one
Yeah,
we can
yeah,
say.
well, and that's kind of what I'm curious about too with the original source material of Jack Kirby, like them trying to move away from the wink nudge of like, well, this could be true. The film was trying to move away from that. And as you mentioned, when we talked about Crystal Skull, it's like, okay, they're throwing the aliens right at you
yeah.
as the
Mhm.
Oh yeah.
premise. What do you think about films like this, which allows us to really frame it and think of it more as like this fantasy? It's like, of course, there aren't superheroes just walking around all day doing crazy things and a giant hand reaching out in the middle of the ocean. Wouldn't some people notice if that was going on?
Mhm.
Like, do you see films like Eternals, which have those roots but aren't being explicit about it in the remake, as more problematic, or does it help to create a fantasy element more?
For me, and I don't know how to, this is definitely my personal opinion. I don't know how to quantify this or measure this at this point, though maybe in a few years we can start seeing the impacts of these films. But I found this film far more problematic. Where it's like if you're honest about what you're doing, if you're blunt about what you're doing, then like it's funny. It's like the movie Stargate. For some reason, it does not bother me in the least. Like it's a very like super obviously ancient alien plotline, and if you want to think that's real, you could probably think it's real from watching the movie. But I think most people are going to watch Stargate and think, "Ha, that was funny." Whereas this has that subtlety to it, where it is so heavily indebted to the literature on which it is ultimately based, and that literature is so fundamentally problematic. I mean, there is the overarching like it's kind of one of these things that like how I reach out and talk about this stuff on social media is I'm less blunt than other people, and I think that there are a variety of reasons why I take the strategy. um, I don't think most people who watch Ancient Aliens are racist. I don't think most people who watch the show even necessarily realize the racial undertones, even though they're there. And so I think there is a problem of just saying like, "Hey, the show's racist," and walking away, because I think that immediately turns people off and doesn't sort of build a bridge and open doors. But at the same time, like there is fundamentally massively problematic source material to deal with here. I mean, the very like the baseline issue is like 90% of the examples, I haven't quantified those, so I don't have a data table, but a vast majority of the examples are non-Western. It's like the non-Western people couldn't have done these things, and they only occasionally come in with Western examples of like, oh well, maybe Baalbek is a problem, but Von Daniken, as he became more and more famous, especially in the 70s, stopped. He stopped caring about like being shy about what he was doing. And his Gold of the Gods is one of his books in the 70s, where he outright talks about things like he paraphrasing here, he suggests that the black race was a failure of alien engineering, and he implies that white Europeans are the favored creation of these alien beings. And that's sort of, like I was saying towards the beginning, where it's like there is hugely problematic racial undertones to all of this. And then we have this Marvel coming in and saying, no, 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 we're going to bring in Chloe Zhao. We're going to bring in a diverse cast. We're going to have, a deaf person. We're going to have a gay couple. We're going to, and it's like, and I applaud those efforts. And I think those are important representational efforts in Hollywood and need to be happening more. But when you put that cloak on top of fundamentally racist source material, I don't know how, this is like the classic, like people yell at me all the time where it's like, it's just a movie, watch it or don't watch it, who cares? And it's like, I do this experiment in my class all the time, not with Ancient Aliens, but with Atlantis. And I'll just go into the classroom and say, hey, what do you know about Atlantis? Anything? Go, tell me. And I start pulling stuff out, and then it's like, all right, how do you know that? And they some of them will know, yeah, it's like some of them like Walt Disney or Aquaman or Plato, and they know that there's sort of maybe something real here, but they're not sure what's real and what's not real. And so I think the more you muddy these waters and the more you play with like, oh, this is just a fun idea, but we're really playing with something that people actually think is true, you get into this really weird nebulous space. I don't know. I've actually been wondering this, and I realized I don't know the answer of when or how Thor became an alien. Like, I don't know if it's purely an MCU conversion, because certainly in the 60s, he reads kind of like more just straight up Norse god. And I don't know when he became an extraterrestrial in this process.
One of the kind of like, I don't have a solid grasp on this, so if there's any comic historians listening, they might be able to help us out. But from my understanding, is like in the sort of early issues of Thor, there was kind of operating under this assumption that like if there is a mythological system, it's real. Like Asgard was real, Olympus is real. Odin can go talk to Zeus, can go talk to Quetzalcoatl, can all this stuff, and they do this sometimes where like these different pantheons will meet up and then produce figures and heroes and stuff like that. And I think in the original Thor, the way it actually worked was like Thor there was like a guy, Donald Blake, that Thor would just like possess his body, and that guy just like turned into Thor.
Forgot about
that. But then there was a later Thor in, I want to say like the early there was a run or a version of Thor, and I forget what the run is called, or like that particular universe is called, where it was like they hedged it a little, and it was sort of like you didn't actually ever really know, like you never saw Asgard or Odin, and it was always sort of unclear whether was Thor like actually a god or was he like a crazy person, or it's like they never, it's a little unclear exactly if like Thor's claims of divinity are actually true. But then so in the MCU, at least, like the first two Thor movies are pretty emphatic that it's like Thor gives, I think, a whole lecture to Jane in the first one where he's like, you call it magic, we call it, or you call it science, we call it magic, it's the same thing. And I think Odin in the second one says something, he's like, we're not gods, we're just space beings who live longer and are stronger. But then in the Taika movies, it gets walked back a little bit, where he obviously in the most recent one very explicitly, but there's like, no, we are gods, we are like worshipped as a pantheon by mortals. And we got into this with Jason last week of like what exactly determines who is and is not a god, and why is a little confusing for all the reasons we just said. But it seems to be that like, yes, Thor is a god, and Loki is a god, and Odin is a god.
Although we got to do a little like Hulk, like puny god going on here too, right? Where it's like,
yeah, and then it just also like it opens up all of these sort of questions of like, is he a god, or is he just like, I think there's a joke somebody said, or in Korg probably says, it's like he's a space Viking. That's basically what he is. So, and also like even in the Marvel comics, it becomes very weird and convoluted, because like where you have the presupposition that like the gods in the mythological systems, they're all real and these are actual gods, but then you've also got the Jack Kirby stuff of like, so like you have Athena and Thena like are two different people, but there's like a natural contradiction going on there of what's going on.
Well, and as you were explaining it, I find it like a little ironic that we have not touched on the Judeo-Christian God. Like God with a capital G is very much left out of this entire picture.
But there is one good line from one of the early days where Captain America says, like, "There's only one God," and he doesn't dress
Mhm.
like that or something, you know.
Right. Yeah, there seems to be at least a distinction between like lowercase g, who are
Hmm.
just more like super powerful entities, however you describe it, but like people, sort of in a very like kind of in like the Greco-Roman or the Norse sense that they're just like they're almost analogous to like kings or emperors or whoever.
Hmm.
And then God, who like we were sort of talking in the Thor, like some a figure like the Celestials or the Eternity is the closest thing we kind of get to in that they're like sort of a cosmic timeless being or something like
That's what I
that.
was just thinking. I mean, we haven't really equated, and I'm not sure if how often it is directly stated of celestials as gods and all of this, but
Mhm.
truly what Eternals was in some way, especially if you look at the opening text to the
Mhm.
film, like it's very like here is the cosmic origin of the
Mhm.
MCU, and the celestials are laid out as its creators basically, and yet they become sort of evil creators as we see at the end of this movie. I don't know how much they will play with Celestials moving forward, but you have sort of an creator god set going on here now.
So this was kind of my like sort of the moral dilemma at kind of in the third act of the movie. They say something like who are we to like stop the birth of a celestial? And it's like because the celestials will go on to create stars and galaxies and planets, which will have billions of lives or civilizations or whatever. And like from my walk away when I first saw the movie and I walked out, I'm like, well, the end of the movie was basically it was a big metaphor for abortion. Whereas like we're debating whether or not
Okay, sure.
the celestial like do we stop the potential life sort of to save the existing life. And that was sort of my whole read on it. But to walk it back a little bit, actually, to Christy's question and what David was saying, I'm jumping all over the place because that my tea is kicking in and it's a little bit too late for me to be drinking caffeine. But the initial question of like, yeah, there is. I worry a little bit because the movie is so very like humanist in a way, where it's very pro human, and
Yeah.
the movie loves love, right? And I think this is one of the only Marvel movies where we actually have like an explicit sex scene.
It is the first one, actually. Yep.
Hmm.
Yeah, we
Officially.
have all sorts of different couples, interracial couple. We have multiple interracial couples. We have gay couples. We have people signing, and it's a very sort of like pro-human and like pro sort of diversity in all its many ways, and like which is something I like about the movie very much. But then that becomes almost a sort of Trojan horse for like the kernel, the celestial growing inside of it that's gonna grow up and blow up the whole planet. Is this like this assumption that like the movie is simultaneously kind of at odds with itself, where it's like humans are great and wonderful and special, but
Hmm.
also toddlers that need a guiding hand at
Mhm.
all times. But so that was sort of that wasn't really an answer to your question, but it's a worry I have and a concern.
I mean, that's just it too, is like, yeah, I think they muddied it. It's very easy to address something that is like, well, here's aliens, and it's like, all right, this is the ideas we're connecting with that. And we can look at the history of archaeology and be like, before aliens, this was how we were explaining the mound builders in the United States. This
Hmm.
is how we were explaining that. And it's really easy to draw those connections. And then when you dress it up the way it is in this film, it's so much more difficult to like draw those parallels to real historical ways we have thought about the past.
Mhm.
And like if we continue to produce movies and shows like that, I didn't realize, but I know that a show that came out on Hulu recently, was it Prey, that's tied to
Yep.
the Predator
Hmm.
thing. And so I haven't watched it. I've heard really great, like
It's
I've
good.
heard
I liked
great
it.
things about it.
Hmm.
And then I just, did the premise of what Predator was all about, because I knew that was a Arnold Schwarzenegger movie originally. And I'm just like, oh my God, it's ancient aliens in a whole nother format.
Well, in this
Yeah.
case, though, they're coming here to kill us. We don't learn
Yeah,
anything from them.
but
Uh,
still, it was like, wow. Like, yeah, they did a new spin on it, but it's like, this is literally everywhere and it's very popular.
That's the thing is that, for me as a scholar trying to research and talk about the origin and development of these ideas, nothing here is new by a long shot.
Hmm.
And that's where, I mean, ultimately these ideas, it's So, like, if you go back to von Daniken's 1968 book, one of his main arguments are that humans would have mistaken aliens as gods, and that any alien technology would have been perceived as magic. That was already a trope. That wasn't like it hadn't happened once or twice in science fiction in the 60s, 50s, 40s, and 30s. Like, it was a trope by the time you get to von Daniken. I actually love at least the oldest story that I'm aware of the quote unquote aliens building the pyramids, as in the Giza pyramids, actually comes from the 1890s. And it's like, this is not a new idea in any way, shape, or form, and there's a ton of fictional claims that these ideas are real, or that there's fictional claims that overlap with people then starting to decide, well, maybe these are real, maybe they're not, I don't know. And so it's just so funny that, like I said, Kirby has this issue of the Fantastic Four, which echoes the plot of Eternals #1, but except the first one comes out before Von Daniken, the second one comes out after Von Daniken, and there's a very real way where, like, the Eternals was riding on Von Daniken's coattails, like, where he was a superstar in the 70s, he really was, and he was getting on the talk shows and getting everywhere, and his books were selling like hotcakes, and it was really problematic. And so it sits at the origin too for sort of the modern paranormal TV world, because of course Ancient Aliens is riff off of Von Daniken, but the old '70s show In Search Of got its big kick off of Ancient Aliens as well, and it is pretty much the entire genre of paranormal TV show now kind of has its origin from these places. And I kind of think, I don't know, I look out at the world around us and I see people having trouble deciding what's real and what's not. And I think maybe, all of these TV shows and books have been kind of a problem.
Yeah, and that's also kind of just it, where, like, I mean, every creative work is a product of its times, but comics very much so, or like, the kinds of heroes and superheroes that get made are very much like products of their time, culture, environment. And Captain America being a very obvious one,
Yes.
is coming out of the 40s and what was going on then. And it makes sort of sense because, like, in the 60s and 70s, where there was this sort of, wave of like spiritualism and interest in the mysticism and the occult and like, non-Western religions and things like that, which, like, very much Jack Kirby is like, that was his vibe, or like, the early sci-fi stuff. So, like, before doing the Eternals, Jack, you mentioned that he had this falling, I say Jack like I knew him, but Kirby had this falling out with Marvel and Stan Lee, and he went over to DC, and then at DC, while he was there, he basically like seeded the DC Comics with basically the same thing as the Eternals, but in DC it's the New Gods, and the idea that like these powerful space beings are the sort of origins for human mythological systems, and that's actually where we get oh god, what's his name? Darkseid, and the first appearance of Darkseid was in a Jimmy Olsen comic, because when Jack Kirby went to DC, they were like, "Oh, you're gonna work here? You think you're hot shit? We're gonna put you on the crappiest detail ever," which was the Jimmy Olsen comic, Superman's friend Jimmy Olsen, and Jack Kirby creates this whole like new world of the New Gods that becomes crazy, and he creates one of the biggest DC characters ever. And then he comes back to Marvel, and then he's basically like, all right, now I'm gonna do that I'm going to really dig into my, the Deviants and the Eternals and the Celestials and all that stuff. Very much is like born out of like what was happening just sort of in like pop culture. And I guess like, the West, New York, West Village, that zone in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm wondering if some of the danger, especially with Marvel movies, like I remember when Titanic came out, and I had seen it, and one of my friends had seen it. I was like in 3rd grade, and my friend to me made the comment of like, only 36 people survived the sinking of the Titanic. And I'm like, that's not right. Like, how did you get that? And it was like at the end of the movie, it has this little title screen of like, only 36 people pulled from the water survived. But like that really simple connection made by a young child, that's kind of what I'm contemplating with like Marvel, why its mass appeal is like superheroes are just as much for fairly young children as it is for adults. So adults might be able to discern, what is pure fantasy more, but like for children, like that's not the case. And I think that might be where some of this danger is too.
I'm skeptical even about the adults. I don't know if you've ever been on
I know,
Facebook
but
lately.
like I can clearly see like how a 3rd grader going to these movies would if you've seen a bunch of these and that's your idea, you definitely aren't really questioning it at that point.
Yeah, it's a really hard line because it's also one of these things where I don't expect and I know that creators, comic book drawers, special effects people, movies people, like their job is not to write history books. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm totally down with the idea that they don't have to, shouldn't have to be perfectly 100% accurate at all times, but there are certain types of mistakes that are made that are more impactful or more problematic in some way,
Mm-hmm.
shapes, and form. And there are mistakes, to like like I joked. I mean, it's like the Hunchback of Notre Dame cartoon wasn't going to have the Colosseum in the background, like that your
Mm-hmm.
audience will pick up on or won't pick up on or will ignore. And we all do this. That's like I said. I get this all the time on social media whenever I try to talk about this stuff. Like, it's just a movie, just watch it. And it's like, yeah, like it's fiction. Like adults, at least, we know it's fiction going in. But 5 years later, 10 years later, where did I hear that? Like, was it a
Mm-hmm.
documentary? Was it on Netflix? Was it somewhere else? Like, we all do this. It all sort of fades into this zeitgeist moment where if it's a movie you loved and you watch over and over again, maybe not. But, it's like if you watch The Eternals, and then 10 years later, like, some old episode of Ancient Aliens pops on TV, you're like, yeah, 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 yeah. Gods in Babylon, they protected people, right? I know that. I've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, and this is one of those things where I'm not like, this is normal human psychology as far as I'm not a psychologist, let's put that out there. But like, this seems to be like normal human memory, like where things slur together all the time. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think creators need to, at the very least, have some cognizance or awareness of like, what could people do with my work,
Mm-hmm.
and be prepared for that at the very least.
Yeah. A
Mm-hmm.
good example of that is Rick Riordan, who did Percy Jackson. And when it was brought to his attention, like how much he's reinforcing what ideas of Western civilization in his books, he really, with that awareness, like changed course and addressed a lot of those problems. But because there's an Eidolon article that I like having my college students read because they grew up on Percy Jackson, and it's
Mm-hmm.
called The Whitening Thief. Like his very first book really is playing into these ideas unintentionally because that's just
Mhm.
something that we are not cognizant of. It's just part of our culture. And until it's pointed out and addressed, like it is possible for creators to do something about that. But it's also very easy to let it creep into our creations because it's just everywhere.
Well, and
So
it also it feeds into itself where it's like in the same way that I think like guys like Kirby are just kind of riffing off like what's in the air at the time. Like it also
mm-hmm,
like if this stuff's sort of permeating in just the general cultural, I don't know, diffusion,
Mhm.
excuse me, or whatever it is, then it ends up getting worked into a movie or a book or a TV show or something like that, and it reproduces that way.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, I was really trying to chase some Doctor Strange stuff a while ago of like, where is Kirby? Like I was really trying to hunt down like where is Kirby like specifically drawing some of his influences, because there's a lot of references to some pretty close echoes to specific references to things happening in the spiritualism movement in the paranormal world. And it's like I can never quite, it's like it's this elusive slippery thing where I don't think he actually was. I really wanted him to be sitting down with a bunch of paranormal books and just copying them into comic books, but I don't think that's what he was actually doing. I think it's just
Mhm.
he's one way or another hearing about it secondhand, third hand, fourth hand, and it just slips out
mm-hmm,
and into his work. And I think especially that early '60s stuff when Doctor Strange is first produced, the rate of production that Marvel and Kirby in particular is doing, like they are coming up with new characters constantly and pushing out books constantly, and it's mostly running right through his art desk. And I think it is, just this like everything in my head I'm going to vomit onto these pages, and it comes out in this slew that's heavily influenced by, and yet you can't actually trace it down. Like what was it? Yeah, my colleague Jeb Card was very interested in the idea that Kirby might have been copying the Shaver Mysteries with the creation of the Eternals. And the Shaver Mysteries is one of these like 1940s pulp fiction stories about some underground Deros and Theros. I think I have that right. There's underground bad guys and above ground good guys, and there are some very real echoes to what Kirby produces. And so I agree with Jeb. I'm just not sure it was deliberate. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure like Kirby even realized what he was doing.
We were talking about this also, not to bring it back to Thor again, but of like the way that like the Marvel cosmology is kind of set up, where you have like this like these celestial beings, there's sort of these cosmic forces that sort of give birth to sort of lower order deities and other things is incredibly reminiscent of like Hesiod's Theogony, for example. And like, had he read the Theogony? And like I kind of suspect not, but I think there's just these ideas about pantheons and mythological systems are just sort of out there in the soup, and that's what he's sort of pulling from.
I'm kicking myself. I can't remember the name of the scholar right now, but I saw a paper a couple of years ago comparing Silver Surfer to Odysseus,
Yeah.
and it was like, oh, there's a lot of strong parallels here.
Mm-hmm. We gotta you send me their name later, because we gotta have them on for our segment where
Yeah.
we make connection, extremely strained and incredibly forced, where we make these kinds of connections. But yeah, exactly. Like it's in. I mean, even if they've read, the introduction to whatever it is, the Odyssey, or they read it once in school when they were in 8th grade, and then it lurks in the memory in some form of it, and then it ends up getting, propagated, and it comes out in whatever the thing is. But then sometimes, like we were sort of saying, that idea is kind of rooted in a problematic notion, like the idea that human beings can't do anything for ourselves, or that like we couldn't have done, all of our technology is indebted to some other benefactor.
That brings me to like one question, probably my last question, but it's been sitting in my head for a long time, is the big event for the break, which also marks the like final death of the deviant until like the start of the movie, is the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan in 1521. And I was wondering what our thoughts are, is like, why was that the event that becomes the breaking point? Like, what is truly significant of that from all other previous genocide events that have taken place historically? I don't know if that's in the source material, if they chose that for the movie, but I'm really
No, yeah,
curious
that's
about that.
definitely just in the movie, as far as I'm aware. I was just actually recording a lecture for this for my students today. I mean, I don't know. I suspect it was random in terms of the movie makers. I could be wrong. They might have wanted to get Tenochtitlan on the screen somehow, but it is the arrival of Europeans in the Americas is, as far as I'm aware, the beginning of the greatest epidemic with the greatest loss of life that the globe has ever seen. I mean, we don't talk about this enough in school. My students are always sort of floored when I lay this out, but I mean, 60%, they always know it. They always know the plague in Europe. I'm like, how many people died in Europe during the plague? And there's always a couple people in the room who know. It's like, oh, it's about 1/3 of Europe. It's like the conservative estimate for the Americas is that 2/3 of all indigenous Americans died, many of them without ever even meeting a European, because the diseases traveled faster than the people did. I am just speaking off the cuff. I do not know, but I would suspect this is the beginning of the worst tragedy in human history in terms of loss of life in one moment or one sort of event. Uh, and it's hardly talked about, at least in Western educational models.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as to why it was put in the movie, I only have two thoughts, and one is just because I think it lines up with the timeline they're kind of setting up, where if they arrive, I forget when it is they arrive in Earth, 7,000 years ago, so they arrive in 5,000 BC, and then then we check in on them every couple hundred years, because it's like Babylon, Gupta India, they mention classical Greece a couple of times, or Macedonia, and then they've diffused out elsewhere, and so like in terms of like a big sort of a world event, they needed, they broke up 500 years ago, which basically puts that right around the right timeline. The other
Sure.
thought I'm having is that it's just in terms of it's a more recognizable, because I think part of what they're also going for is just recognition,
Yeah.
and like skirting the line. They don't necessarily go like straight to say like the Giza pyramids, which is probably like maybe one of the most iconic sites, but like they've got Babylon and the gates, which is a thing that people probably are maybe vaguely aware of, at least in some capacity. But with the Americas, like there is a sort of general, there's an awareness. So like we see it on screen, and we, the audience, immediately know what's happening. We don't need it to be spelled out, as opposed to if you pick some more obscure or maybe just less taught historical event. So it serves as sort of the shorthand is effective there for communicating to the audience that like we know what's happening. We don't need it. Someone doesn't need to come out and be like, this is the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And it also, I think, speaks also just to like the current climate, particularly in North America, where like now fewer and fewer cities are celebrating Columbus Day. We celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day and things like that. And I think it feeds into just that sort of general movement and a reckoning with the past history of colonization in the Americas. So that's sort of my short answer.
Yeah. I think my question, like part of it was like, was that in the source material? Because it also just flattened out that event as if like, oh, it was the Europeans who came and did this killing. And yes, the plagues definitely wiped out massive amounts of people. We see that in ice cores to the point like, I think some archaeologists have looked at ice cores and believe that so many people died in the Americas that there was enough growth of trees that probably contributed to the little ice age because there was that much more oxygen in our atmosphere, which is mind blowing to think about. But in terms of like the intricacies of that conflict, your Cortez would not have succeeded without the involvement of other indigenous people. And like, so I think what I was also frustrated about that was like, it really flattened that and made it once again look like Europeans versus indigenous people. And obviously who wins because they had the advanced technology given to them by the Eternals. And I'm like, damn it, no.
No, there's a lot of that going on there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's also all sorts of, I mean, I have all sorts of the rabbit holes that I often go down of like picking apart the little logic problems, which is like, my question is like, how actually involved is Festus in our technological process? Because when we have a very short scene, a very sort of odd scene, I think, where basically following like Hiroshima and the first atomic bomb, and he basically says like, this is my fault, like, because I gave them whatever it was thousands of years ago, or it's unclear whether like did he work on, like, I don't think he worked on that project, but like he does all technology come back to him, which is a pretty wild implication.
Yeah, it's like they really try to show it like that, what Ajax, Selma Hayek's character Ajax tries to keep him in check and whatnot. It's like, oh no, like don't give them that stuff yet, or let them figure it out themselves. But that scene in particular implies that like Hephaestus certainly thinks human technology is all his, on him. And so, that again, apparently we couldn't do anything on our own. I don't know.
And again, also it comes back to, I think, a more interesting theme that is sort of like not as explored, which is that like conflict and war being a great mover of sort of like technology, and like how many sort of technological advancements, even ones like in fields of like medicine and communications, like emerged out of wars. It's partially on the brain because I just recently rewatched 2001 Space Odyssey, where like the kind of thesis, like the first scene is basically the thesis of that is like weapon violence is what elevates us from monkeys into, space stations or whatever. But then also it's kind of just more of the same thing.
Well, that was specifically Raymond Dart's idea too, though, like where Arthur C. Clarke was cribbing off of Raymond Dart, who was an early paleontologist or paleoanthropologist who proposed the osteodontochoratic tool system being used by Australopithecines. And I remember, I will never forget, like when I was an undergrad, one of our professors showed us a video interviewing Dart about this, and Dart was explicit about violence being a motivating factor in hominin evolution. And he had some like, I don't know, like jawbone or something, and he's like, and they took the jawbone and stabbed it into the neck of the other hominins. And it was like, oh.
It's like, I think there's like a joke in Community like that, where it's like you're giving, I think it's Betty White is like their anthropology professor, and she's like, well, you have to like, what's the greatest invention that humans have made? And then at the end, he gives some sort of stirring speech about compassion. And then she's like, no, it's this crossbow that I invented. And then she shoots him in the leg with it.
Yeah, like I think the other argument, at least in terms of not necessarily advancement of technology, but where we get stratification within society, is often, to me, tied to the development of agriculture and sedentary lifestyles, where you have to delegate tasks to
the division of labor leading to the
it's
first.
like, oh, we really screwed ourselves. So maybe that plow that he was working on was more dangerous than anything.
The plow invents the caste system or whatever it is, or social hierarchies. Well, so maybe my sort of thesis about this movie is it actually might have just worked better as a TV show, because I think it just has sort of narrative problems and things like that, and structure. It has a big villain problem, I think, where the main villain disappears and then comes back randomly at the end. But
Mhm.
Well, they wanted to do a cosmology movie. At least I think they want to do a cosmology movie, especially again with that intro text and whatnot. But then
mhm.
this is, I don't know what, the 20th, 24th, 25th Marvel movie. They've already got a cosmology sort
Yeah.
of built movie by movie, and I think they wanted to make something bigger and grander, but kept like bumping into things that didn't make sense. And
Mhm.
it was too late to do
Which
this
also
movie.
is kind of interesting given the choice of director, because Chloe Zhao, to me at least, kind of the strength of so many of her films is that they're deeply kind of introspective and inward,
Hmm.
inwardly focused on the lives of their characters, which we get a little bit, but maybe not enough of. Like, we get the stuff with Sprite sort of never being like the reason she resents humanity is because they remind her of all the things she can't have, like growing up and having a family and things like that. Or the again, I sort of see the main division, like the ideological division between like Icarus and Cersei is almost like a faith-based one, whereas Icarus is loyal to Arishem, his sort of the doctrine, the creator, the creed, or whatever. And then whereas the other ones are more progressive or radical in some way. And so, yeah, the kind of central, like the sort of psychological levels of what's going on for these people who also find out, like, they actually find out the reason for which they've been created, and it sort of shatters their whole worldview and sense of purpose. But yeah, and again, I don't know. I wonder if there's just like too many characters, too many things, too many themes, and none of it necessarily rises to the top. But
Yeah.
It is the hardness of an ensemble pick superhero movie. Like the more characters you add, the harder it
mm,
gets.
Hmm.
mm-hmm.
There's a
Yeah,
reason the Avengers movie came after
Hmm.
yeah.
everyone had their own standalone film for a long.
Well, like, yeah, with like Guardians, there's only what, 5 Guardians, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah, and there are, how many Eternals are there? Hang on. I think there's like 9 Eternals or
Yeah,
something.
yeah,
And it becomes hard, and then ultimately we sort of lose, I could have really used a lot more Makari, who was to me
Yeah.
a more interesting character. Like, why was she collecting all of these artifacts and stealing secrets? And partly it's because she's supposed to be Mercury, but like, that whole character for me felt very underserved, but there's just no room for it. This is only a 2.5 hour movie. And then we also have to do, because it's an MCU in phase 4, we got to also do a lot of table setting for Black Knight at the end, everything with Kit Harington and whatever that's going to be.
yeah. If that, I don't know. I feel that feels like one of the cliffhangers that's not going to come through. I don't know. I haven't heard anything, but
Well, so I think so. The other thing, what I sort of know is that the voice that talks to him in that very end, Chris, that's Mahershala Ali, who's going to be Blade. But I understand the production of
okay.
Blade is being held up. There's some problem with Blade, and I think he might have. There's like some dimension of the universe they're spinning off that's more of like monster hunters and dark
Yeah,
magic and that kind of thing. And I think Black Knight fits into that. But I don't know when that will ever come to light. And again, like Harry Styles and Pip the Troll, and like what that all is. So
Whew.
we're just over an hour now, and Dave, I don't want to keep you too late because it's I'm sure approaching everyone's bedtime.
yes.
But any final thoughts people want to end with? Final verdicts?
Oh, I was gonna say the one thing I found hilarious is that the joke being made how Angelina Jolie got to do all of the poses that Brad Pitt got to do in Troy with the spear. And I'm like, you know what? I
That's good.
appreciate that. Bravo.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I appreciate you that Colin. You brought up the Sprite storyline because I think that was one of the good, like, that was one of the more impactful personal stories that is in here. I think there are great individual moments in this film. I think there are good actors in this film and good characters in this film, and I think they really intended to make a film that represented sort of the best of humanity in some way, shape,
Mhm.
or form. And it's just back to where I started. It's like, why did you pick this storyline? I love my comic books. Like, I like my boxes over here. Like, I can get you like a bunch of other like storylines that you could have done a great human interest piece with. If you weren't going to bother like tying Thanos in here, why did we do this?
Mhm.
Keep this one on the shelf, maybe. Maybe if there's
Yeah,
not an
Yeah,
Eternals 2, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world.
it
yeah,
would
we'll
not be the
see.
worst. Yeah, we could this hopefully this is one of the threads that just doesn't get picked back up.
I mean, I at least maybe just want somebody to kind of mention. It seems the most insane thing about this whole movie is that a giant statue emerges out of the Indian Ocean and nobody talks about it ever.
Never. It's done. It's just sitting
that
there.
there was a giant stone person living inside the planet, and we had no idea. And now there's just a huge statue in the middle of the ocean.
Although that does feel very 2022, where it's just like, I don't know, I gotta go to work.
Well, that's like, wasn't there a thing where like the Navy like said like we have all of these like unidentified flying objects and we truly have no idea what they are. Do with that what you will. And people were like, meh.
Yeah.
Like the news.
Yeah. I gotta make dinner. I gotta do laundry.
I don't know. Yeah, the weirder stuff is happening. So yeah, I think we'll end it there. But David, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Hope we didn't keep you too late or ruin your evening.
Thank you all for having me again. I appreciate it, and we'll come back for Wakanda Forever at some point, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm probably gonna go try to see that this weekend, and we gotta come back and talk Namor. Is there anything, if people want to see or hear more from you, where can they do that?
The easiest, I am trying. We were talking at the beginning here. I don't know what I'm gonna do with my Twitter. I don't know. Twitter's kind of like its own dumpster fire right now, but that's usually where people find me, at DSA Archaeology. I've got the same thing. I've got a DSA Archaeology over on Instagram and Facebook, and I just set up a Mastodon. I don't know how people find you on Mastodon yet, but there is a DSA Archaeology on Mastodon as well, so you can find me on the socials in all different places.
Excellent. As usual, listeners, you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, movieswedig.com. Follow us. Again, we're tentatively we're sticking around on Twitter, although we're not that active on Twitter, but you can still, for the time being, find us at @digmovies. Thank you again, everyone, for coming by, and I'll see you again soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye.